California, so it's in the 80s here today, I think. But
Mm.
well, I know it's been in the hundreds out there on the West Coast. So
It's always cold in San Francisco, and it's smoky with all these fires.
right, right.
Hey all, I think we might be live. So let's get our cameras off except for Carmen. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Gathering for Justice Radical Reads with Sean King. My name is Carmen Perez Jordan, and I am the president and CEO of the Gathering for Justice. For those of you who don't know the story, 15 years ago and 2 days, the legendary activist and the legendary artist and activist, I was trying to say artivist, Harry Belafonte brought together elders of the civil rights movement and youth from across the US to form a covenant to end child incarceration and to dismantle the systemic racism in our justice system. Mr. B, as we affectionately call him, was responding to a story on the news about a 5-year-old girl named Jaisha Scott, who had been handcuffed in her kindergarten class for throwing a tantrum. 15 years later, the Gathering for Justice continues our mission with renewed energy and with 2 statewide task force, Justice League NYC and Justice League California, while expanding our programming and our agenda. I also have to mention that I was one of those young people 15 years ago when Mr. B started the Gathering for Justice. So I've actually grown up with this organization. But I want to introduce to you all our Radical Read series, which is our monthly book series that we occasionally take live with our conversations with authors, including Centoya Brown Long, Jason Lee, Linda Sarsour, and Myson Lennon. Tonight we have the honor to have our really good friend, Sean King, with us to discuss his new book, which came out on August 4th, called Make Change. I also had the opportunity of introducing Chapter 8, Organized People, for his audiobook. And I have to say that that was such a fun experience. And now it's my privilege to introduce to you my friend and comrade, Sean King. Sean King is one of the most followed and shared activists and journalists of the planet. A fearless force of nature for social change and systemic change, Sean has authored more than 1,500 articles on topics ranging from police brutality and mass incarceration to white supremacy and voter suppression. His social good campaigns have raised nearly 40 million for families in need, and his dogged pursuit of violence against white supremacists in Charlottesville help identify, track down, and bring to justice more bigots than the work of the FBI and state police combined. The former senior justice writer for the New York Daily News, social justice writer for The Intercept, and writer in resistance at Harvard Law, Sean is now the editor-in-chief of the North Star and the voice of social justice on the legendary Tom Joyer morning show. He is also the host of The Breakdown that I got to be on last week, the popular daily news podcast, which not only unpacks and explains the problems of the world, but it gives listeners a clear action and next steps on what to do. But I also want to mention that Sean King is somebody who I call up, who calls me when there are events, things happening across the country. And I'm so happy to have you on our show today. So happy to share this book, which we ask everybody to go out and buy it. And I'll let you all know later, Make Change. But, you know, you've been somebody who I've been talking to for quite some time. You know, there have been moments many years ago, I believe in 2015, when we had a conversation around what was happening, not only politically, but personally. And I really appreciate the fact that you've come on to share your story, but I also appreciate the fact that you're continuously seeking justice, regardless of what's happening around you. You're consistently sharing your story. But I want to know, and I want you to share with people before we bring on readers, what was your inspiration behind writing this book? And welcome.
I did the typical Zoom thing. I was muted. I told myself that I wouldn't do it, and sure enough, I was still muted. No, thank you for having me, Carmen. And this is actually my third Radical Reads event. I was there for Centoya Brown, and I was there I think the last live in-person event might have been Linda's event. That was right
Mm-hmm.
before the pandemic. And so it's my honor to be here with you and some of my friends and our friends. Um, I wrote the book really after almost 6 years of travel at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement from 2014 until now. I've traveled to 47 states. I've traveled to almost every major city in the country and everything in between, from almost 50 cities in California to as far west as Hawaii, as far north as Alaska. I've been all over the Midwest, from North and South Dakota, Montana, all throughout the South, as far northeast as Maine. And in all of those travels over those 47 states, I was really surprised almost right away that I always got one recurring question.
That's
And
right.
it was a question that people asked me in 2014 that I thought would go away. But in 2015 and 2016, even today, I got this same question in email. People DM it to me. They want to know, in spite of all of the work that we've done fighting for justice, people still are stumped at how they use their lives to make a real change in the world. And so everywhere I go, even before the pandemic, I'm here in Brooklyn right now, just walking the streets of New York, people will stop me and they'll say something like this: Sean, I'm frustrated about injustice in the world. And they might name police brutality, or they might name a case. But then they'll ask me, like, Sean, I'm frustrated. Sean, I've marched, I've demonstrated. They might say, Sean, I've donated. Sean, I've voted. But the problem is still there. What do I actually do with my life to change this issue in a deep, substantive way? And after getting that question, Carmen, probably well over 1,000 times, I really realized that in spite of my own work and effort, I
Mm-hmm.
thought I was telling people how to change the world. I
Mm-hmm.
realized that people just need a deeper answer to that. And so the book is really my 272-page answer to that question. Here is how you use your life to make a deep, substantive change on systems. Here's how we change the systems that continue to ail us. And you know, I realized that what works for one person may not work for another. And so after years of giving people kind of quick cut and paste answers, I
Mm-hmm.
decided to finally just sit down and take my time and write it in book form, so that I could always not just point to the book, but say, hey, how you change the world is actually pretty complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I take time in the book to really unpack what that looks like. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
really my drive to write it was to be able to give people a real honest answer for how change actually works.
I really appreciate that because you are somebody that a lot of us go to for information. We go to your social media to see what's currently happening. We also listen to the breakdown, but to actually have it in a book form and be able to highlight and reference back some of these stories, we'll get into that later in the program. But I also, you talked about traveling to all these states. Where did you find the time with 5 children, with 3 organizations, two or three organizations that you oversee, right? To actually write it. You make change so intentionally, right? Considering you oversee Grassroots Law, Real Justice PAC, and the North Star, and all these other things that you're also trying to find time to do, especially with the families that are directly impacted by some of the issues of police brutality and even incarceration. Where did you find time to write a book? Tell us, because some of us make excuses, and that's one of the chapters in your book, right?
Yeah. Well, it was hard, like there's not a pretty answer to it. That question in some ways reminds me of some people ask me, how do I balance all of those things? And my honest answer is that I don't do a great job at balancing all of those things. And, to be able to make time to write the book in a lot of ways just meant other people, including my family and the organizations. I really had to squeeze time away from them to even be able to write it. My hope was that finally having the book in hand would give even the organizations that I help lead and the people that we're helping, that it would give them a guide. Like the book is not it's not an autobiography. Now, I tell my story throughout the book, but it's really meant to be two things, like my philosophy of change, and it's meant to be a guide for how you can use your life to do that. And um, it required a lot of time away from the family. And, I thank my wife and kids and family in the book, because it required a lot of time away from them for sure to be able to do it. It's once you write a book, you'll always appreciate kind of the isolation and time away that authors have to have had to be able to get it to that point.
And I certainly want to just recognize the sacrifice that is often made when working in this field, and not just the sacrifice that you're making, but also that of your families. And so we're excited to have your wife also be part of today's program. And so we're going to go ahead and introduce the readers so that our audience can actually get some snippets of your book. So I want to bring on Lieutenant Edwin Raymond, who is also someone who is running for New York City Council District 40. So welcome, Edwin.
Thanks for having me, Carmen and Sean. You already know the respect and love that I have for you, both of you. You guys support me and you guys respect me despite the conflict, if you will, of me being a law enforcement official, which I see often through the comments, that you guys have both taken some heat for that. So I appreciate you guys knowing that I'm sincere.
We appreciate you.
Always, man. Yeah, good to see you.
All right, do I jump right in?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so this is Make Change. I have two copies, two physical copies, and the electronic copy, which I'm still reading. Okay, so Morehouse represented a fresh start for me. No bullies, no rednecks, no pickup trucks, no white supremacy. It was a beautiful, peaceful mecca of Black manhood, with nearly 3,000 proud young Black men attending from 38 states in nearly 20 countries. At Morehouse, Black people ran everything, from the security to the landscaping, to the dorms, to the cafeteria, to the classrooms and the boardrooms. It was like our personal own Wakanda. There we felt like we could safely let our guard down and just be curious young Black men. The swagger and the masks that we would often feel pressured to wear in society weren't necessary there. Police brutality and racism didn't even exist in that beautiful bubble. We actually loved our campus police officers, an all-Black police force that knew us by name and were only there to protect us and to keep outsiders from entering the campus to cause us any harm. And so it was there on that campus in perfect peace that I started to rebuild my confidence, letting go of the hurt of the past. In high school, every single day was hard. There, I had been focused more on survival than on my own growth and development. Morehouse was the exact opposite. It ended up being an incubator, not just for me, but for so many of us who had grown up in dangerous circumstances where we were denied a fair chance to learn or lead. My major was African American Studies, which was a rather new program inside of the history department. There I found my people, like-minded students who were equally frustrated about systemic racism and injustice and were determined to do something about it. I had never had a single Black teacher in my entire life until I got to Morehouse. Most of us hadn't. Now we were being taught revolutionary new paradigms about manhood and masculinity, power, leadership, and social change by men like Professors Larry Crawford, Kurt Young, as well as Doctors Aaron Parker, Marcellus Barksdale, and Melvin Raming. I learned more about myself and my place in the world during the first semester of my freshman year than I had learned in my whole life up to that point. And I thrived in this new environment. Right out of the gate, I became president of my dorm, a volunteer in King Chapel, and an active presence in a vibrant African-centered Black consciousness community that had formed at the Atlanta University Center. It would be hard to fully explain just how radical I was during this time, but let me try to paint a picture for you. When I was later sworn in as a student government president, I wore a dashiki and raised a Black Power fist in the air the whole time. I owned my own megaphone and had a backup battery pack for it. I was that guy. I was Captain Woke. To be clear, I mean that in the cheesiest way possible. That was good.
Sometime in the summer of 2015, I began to notice an interesting phenomenon in conversations and on the internet. I first picked up on it that June after a white supremacist named Dylan Roof walked into a small group Bible study and prayer meeting being held at the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He was out of place, a quiet, withdrawn white man, a stranger in an intimate Bible study of nothing but close Black friends. Skeptical or not, it was the tradition of the church and of almost all Black churches to accept the presence of an outsider. Within minutes, Ruth shot and killed the pastor, Clementa Pinckney, and 8 other faithful men and women who had gathered together in that room. Long before the news of the shooting hit network news, it began spreading on social media and all over Twitter, which in the absence of any Black news network had to fill in the gaps of what had happened in Charleston. I saw tweets that said things like, "It feels like we're going back in time. I swear this feels like some old school KKK shit." And what is this, the 1960s? The expectation was that we had progressed to a place and a time where such things would no longer happen, a miscalculation that did not properly account for the wild and painful pendulum swings that history frequently takes. If we take the von Ranke approach to time and history and honestly lay out every moment, good, bad, and ugly, on a timeline of American history, a very different story than one of steady, predictable growth and progress emerges. Instead, we see that with American history, like all human history, humanity consistently experiences peaks and valleys, soaring highs and unbelievable lows. And when humankind does improve in beautiful ways, it does not mean that it will remain that way or get better. The only sure bet is that human beings will swing back and forth between their best and worst instincts. Those low periods are what I refer to as the dip. Dips in human history are where we see deep, systematic, widespread suffering and oppression, where we find genocide and famine, slavery and war. It's where codified bigotry and inequality become woven into society, where oppression is not just legalized, but normalized. The dip is where bigotry, hatred, and violence are so routine that they become background noise in our society. And let me tell you this, these dips do not appear at random, not at all. When a historic moment, be it a war or a movement that produces a sweeping new set of policies, interrupts the status quo, and particularly if it displaces or is perceived to threaten the people who hold the power, a drastic dip almost always follows.
Until you make a serious decision to fight for one single cause, your impact on the world will remain in a holding pattern. I bet you always know your cause is. You may always have even made the decision in your mind a few times, but never quite made it official. What I've learned is that most activism doesn't die in the streets. Most dreams of chasing the world die in our own minds long before we even allow them to materialize. We talk ourselves out of making a difference in the world far more than anybody else talks us out of such a thing. What I want you to understand is that as long as you remain neutral in the face of oppression and danger, your indifference and the collective indifference of millions of others will only allow us to slide deeper into the dip. We won't find our way out of it by accident. Climbing that steep mountain is a choice. Right now, as you consider what the cause of your life is going to be and prepare to move forward with it, your mind is going to be flooded with a litany of excuses to derail you. Let's try to debunk those.
I'm too young. This will never be true. Your youthful zeal and energy, your hopeful and spirited vision, and your willingness to confront powerful people and systems are all needed in the fight for change. Every successful social movement throughout history has had young people at the center of it. The movement throughout history has had young people at the center of it. The horrible policies and practices we see right now will affect you and your generation more than anyone else. While so many people in power are invested in keeping the systems of this world just the way they are, you know damn well that the status quo is not good enough. And I want you to use that knowledge to fight for the future you deserve. Have you ever heard of Claudette Colvin? Most people haven't, but she should be a household name. On March 2nd, 1955, a full 9 months before Rosa Parks became known to the world, 15-year-old Claudette was arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white woman. As she yelled that it was constitutional right to have her seat, local police came onto the bus, confronted Claudette, arrested and handcuffed her, and took her to jail. This was months before grown folks did it. Claudette set the stage. Her actions were a spark for the city. Young Claudette actually served as one of the plaintiffs in Browder versus Gale, a case that went all the way to Supreme Court, which eventually determined once and for all that bus segregation in Alabama was unconstitutional.
8 years later, on May 2nd, 1963, more than 1,000 Black students from all over Birmingham, Alabama, including young elementary school children, walked out of their schools to protest forced segregation and oppression in their city. An astounding 973 children were arrested by police that day, all on the grounds that they did not have a permit for their march. It is widely thought to be the largest mass arrest of children in the entire history of the country. When other children took up the mantle the next day, the bigoted police chief, Bull Connor, ordered that these brave kids be sprayed with fire hoses and met with police dogs. And for days, these children continued to protest. In the face of all of this danger, as the nation began seeing the horrible images from these events, it put an enormous amount of pressure on Birmingham's white power structure to end the segregation ordinances and their local businesses. Right now, some of the leading voices on climate change, gun control, women's rights, immigration, and so much more are teenagers. Environmental activist Greta Thunberg was just 16 when she helped lead one of the largest climate strikes in the history of the world. In New York, Luis Hernandez started the brilliant organization Youth Over Guns when he was just 16, and he has become one of the most important voices in the nation for stopping gun violence in our communities. The March for Our Lives, which came about in the painful aftermath of 17 people being shot and killed and 17 more being injured at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, raised millions of people together to confront gun violence. It was fueled and organized by high school students. Young people have been bravely speaking truth to power for thousands of years. Your unique perspective simply can't be duplicated by anybody else. You aren't too young. You're just right.
I'm too old. This is tough for me to swallow, but when I walk into most rooms full of organizers and activists these days, I am regularly the oldest person in the room. I damn near lost my cool when some teenagers called me an elder recently, but it's true. Regardless, we all have a role to play and we're never too old to start fighting for change. It doesn't matter if you are twice my age, the movement for change needs your wisdom and your perspective. It needs your connections and resources. It needs your stories and insight. Put simply, it needs your presence. In 2018, I was privileged to host a conversation with the legendary Harry Belafonte. He was 91 years old and as sharp as ever. He showed up to the event in a Trayvon Martin hoodie and dropped more wisdom on the audience in an hour than I could in a year. The man was born 2 years before Dr. King and has found a way to contribute to society into his 90s. For the past 20 years, he has been an indispensable advisor to some of the leading activists in the world. You aren't too old to fight for change, not at all. Your ability to bring a multi-generational perspective to the problems of our world is urgently needed.
That was powerful. I want to thank, we already, acknowledged Lieutenant Edwin Raymond, but you also heard from Ray King, who is the CEO of the North Star, a lifelong educator, the founder of the Hands In Co-op, a mother of 5. Could you believe that? And also, while she's navigating all that, she is Sean King's wife. So let's give it up for her. Thank you so much for reading today. I also want to thank Ashley and Michelle Monterosa, who are students. They are activists. They are currently on the front lines fighting for justice for Sean, their brother, who was killed at the hands of police by Vallejo police in California. So please check them out. They are on social media, Instagram, Justice4 Sean. You also heard from Luis Hernandez himself, who was in the book. Luis is a young activist. He was brought to us at the Gathering for Justice by introduction of Sean King. We were introduced to his family, who was fighting for their brother, their son, Pedro Hernandez. Luis is the executive director of Youth Over Guns. He is also a Justice League NYC member and the Gathering for Justice Youth Engagement and Leadership Coordinator. Last but not least, my sister Queen Yanazda, who is an activist. She is a sister soldier. She is out on the front lines all over the country, internationally. And so thank you all for reading excerpts of Make Change. And Sean, we're going to continue with you, but let's go ahead and thank them all.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was so good to see each of you. And man, you know, I haven't read the book since it's been published, and hearing you all read it, it just brought it to life. So thank each of you so much.
All right, so let's get started with the program. So I'm just, reading it. This was something that was brought up in a conversation with myself and Luis, who, just read part of your book. We talked about on one of our program calls, how you shared your story, but you grounded it in history and connected it to action in the current movements. Why did you choose to write your book this way? And I know that you answered some of that earlier, but why?
I mean, I didn't want to write a guide to how to change the world that wasn't interesting. I wanted to tell interesting stories from my life. And then my training is actually as a historian. My undergraduate and graduate degrees are both in history. And I wanted to root the book and the truths in the book into something deeper than just like my knowledge of just like, here's what I, Sean King, have learned in life. I wanted it to be deeper than just there may be a point like when I am as wise as Mr. B where I can just tell you what I know because I know it. But I wanted to root the book in some deeper truths that weren't just like nuggets from my life. And so I tell my story, but I anchor the book in a lot of deeper truths about human history and how time unfolds and some of the lessons that I've learned from studying how people fought for change over time as well. So some things we can reasonably predict if we do them, that they will work. And we can predict it because you can look at people who've taken certain action steps over time. And when I say it will work, that doesn't mean you'll be popular. It doesn't mean that you'll be loved. You've caught me, Carmen, on a day where I am probably as unpopular today as I have been in all of 2020. But the book is not about how to be loved. It's about how to be effective.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about how to learn how to ride the ups and downs of this work, which is incredibly difficult. We have Ashley and Michelle Monterosa on, and their brother Sean was murdered, and I'm working now with almost 60 different families whose loved ones have been killed by police. And just that work alone requires me and will require anybody who wants to do this work to be anchored in something deeper than yourself, and so I try to share lessons that I think will help guide people through some difficult times.
That's definitely something that you shared. And I believe your Make Change, You Must Make a Choice chapter,
Yeah.
where you talked about fighting for change is difficult and it's often a thankless battle, right? So certainly, I think all of us could relate to that. But, beginning to read your book, I did recognize the person who wrote your foreword. So just wanting to know, like, what was your thinking around having Bernie Sanders write your forward? Why was that important to you?
Yeah. Well, it was important for a couple of reasons. One, I've gotten to know him and really respect and love him, and my family's gotten to know him and spend some time around him. But he actually very much started his young life as an activist and organizer.
Mhm. That's right.
We've grown to see him as an elected official, as a politician, but he has really remained very much rooted in organizing and the principles of organizing and activism deep into his life as a politician. Um, I wanted him to also have a chance to kind of tell his own story in the forward about how he really began his life as a leader um,
Mhm.
in 1960. Before the March on Washington, he began his life as a young leader, literally the president of his local chapter of SNCC. And I just wanted people to be able to see that he was a part of the Congress of Racial Equality, the president of that. He merged it with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee,
Mhm.
and he was literally getting arrested and putting his life on the line of fighting against bad schools in Chicago, fighting against bad dorms for Black students at the University of Chicago. And those lessons really shaped his whole life and shaped how he saw his future life. He was mayor of Burlington. I tell a couple stories about him in the book about all the times that he has fought for change and failed. And when he wrote the
Mhm.
foreword, he was running for president, but we didn't know if he would win the nomination or not. But I have a part of a chapter where I talk about he ran for Congress 5 times before he won. Like,
Wow.
this was a guy that was just determined. And
Mhm.
here he is now, literally almost 80 years old, still just trying to figure out, how do I stop Trump? How do I fight for policies that I care about? So I see him as somebody who's tried to squeeze every bit of energy out of his life to make a difference in the world. And he did for people who get a chance to hear the audiobook, he also did his audio introduction as well, which we were super glad to do. And he did a great job too. So it was super cool.
Yeah, that's exciting. Like I mentioned before, I got to introduce chapter 8, and that was a fun, after that, I was like, ooh, I should probably do voiceovers.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
you
You were
get I was telling my husband, I was like, did you hear what I sent you? But it's great that you had him and that he was able to share his story, because that's what we captured when we were reading the forward was, a person who was part of the civil rights movement, who
Yeah.
had always been an activist, who had always been on the front lines fighting. And like you said, you don't see that with folks that get into office. But I want to talk about your childhood, and I'm going to skip around a little bit, even though there's different elements of the book. I wanted to go in a sequence of like the beginning to end, but I'm going to jump around because I think it's important for folks to listen to the fact that you were raised racially ambiguous, right? Your family didn't talk about race,
No.
which nowadays race is such an important part of everyday conversation. But do you think that was intentional? Do you think that that was because?
Yeah, let me unpack it.
Yeah, of course.
I try to tell that part of my story for 2 reasons. I want white readers who read it to see how I was raised and be like, yeah, that's how they were raised as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I also want to give all other people, Black folk and all other communities of color, a glimpse into what it's like to be raised in a white household.
Mm-hmm.
I've had this conversation with a lot of Black children and multiracial children who were raised by white parents. In fact, one of the first conversations I had with Colin Kaepernick was about this. He and I both were raised by super loving, kind white families in the 80s who really taught us almost nothing about race and racism. And it wasn't deliberate. They had almost no knowledge to share.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm 40. And so I was born in 1979. I grew up in rural Kentucky. My mother, who I talk with today, a sweet country white woman in a rural factory town. She taught me a lot of principles about good and bad. She taught me she taught me to stand up against bullies. She taught me to treat people fairly, but she had very little knowledge of the history of racism and bigotry in the town I grew up in. So for instance, in my house, like all Black families, we've had what people call the talk. We've had some, and there's not a talk, there are hundreds of talks that you give to you, and it's not to just to your boys. We have 4 girls and a boy. Our kids are in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college. And there are all types of unique ways that we have to prepare our children for the world. Well, my mother or Colin Kaepernick's parents, they never gave the talk to us. They didn't even know to give it. They didn't even know what it was to give. And what happened was, by the time I got to be in high school, all of my Black friends in school had a racial IQ, if you will, that was way higher than mine. They had not just conversations about injustice, not just the pain of being Black in this little town, but they were prepared and raised in a way to understand the nuances of culture that white parents who are raising Black or multiracial children just struggle with. Now, in 2020, there are books for that. There are support groups for that.
Mm-hmm.
I was being raised in the early and mid 80s, and I didn't even know what to call myself. Like, I didn't have many of the role models, and I didn't have a lot of the language. All I knew was that I looked different. I even thought, like, people would tell me that I looked different. When I was in second grade, Black children in the school started asking me, was I Black? Was I mixed? And I didn't even know what to make of it. And
Mm-hmm.
my mother had never really had the hard conversations with me to let me know that there's going to be this day where people really are curious about my ethnicity. And it started me down this path of having to figure out a lot of those hard answers for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's just a lot more preparation that even white families have today. But I mean, it created a lot of challenges for me. And it was a huge part of why, when I eventually was able to get out of there and be in a Black community at Morehouse, I was just like a sponge at that point.
Mm-hmm. I know that there was an incident the week after your freshman year that I feel is also what has helped shape your life, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, when I got to high school, Carmen, I had been a bridge builder my whole life. Like, I had
Mm-hmm.
always been, even in part because I was multiracial, I saw a part of my calling. I didn't use that word as a child, but I saw
Mm-hmm.
part of my existence as being somebody who brought different races together, people from different economic backgrounds together. And for my entire life until I got to high school, I was always pretty popular and well liked. I had been in student leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
When I got to high school, I had no idea what I was walking into. It was like a racial powder keg, and there was just a history of bigotry and racism and anti-Blackness at this school. that my friends understood was going to be there, and also understood some of the unspoken rules on how to maneuver around it. And so when I got there to high school, I had none of those tools, none of those resources. And I found myself instantly just thrown into fights, having to defend myself. And eventually there was this huge brawl at a football game that I was at the center of. And this was just, I'd only been in school for a couple of weeks at this point, my freshman year. And it got so violent that police were called. It was on the news. It was like it was a major brawl. Adults got involved. And when I got back to school, that was on a Friday. When I got back to school on that Monday, they called me to the office. Almost, I don't even think I got through the first period. They called me up to the office and told me that I was being suspended for being in this fight. Now, I didn't even want anything to do with the fight. And
That's right.
for the 4 days that they suspended me, the school, during those 4 days, the school decided that they were going to ban Confederate flags, Confederate flag T-shirts, Confederate flag memorabilia. This is 1993.
Wow.
And that they were going to also ban anything related to Malcolm X. Malcolm X T-shirts. The movie had just come out the year before. And when I got back to school on that Thursday, white students the day before it had a major walkout about this new ban on Confederate flags. And it was on all the local news channels. It was in the newspaper. When I got back to school that Thursday, it was as if the fight I was in that previous week, they treated me like I was the one that caused the ban on the Confederate flags. Even though my fight, I didn't even know that the fight I was in had anything to do with the Confederate flags. It kind of happened after my fight. And for the next year and a half, my whole experience in high school was brutal. I had that following month, I had a student. This was in the middle of a school day. This is how country the school was. White students would chew chewing tobacco in school, like, and they were allowed, and they would spit it in like regular jars. And a student threw a jar of chewing tobacco spit like right on my face. I knew who did it. I reported it. Nothing happened. I literally ran home. I lived about a mile away from the school and just ran home crying, embarrassed. I had 2 different incidents where students in pickup trucks literally tried to run me over, and I narrowly escaped both times. One time I saw every student who was involved, reported it to the police, reported it to the school, and nothing happened. And because I would report these things and nobody would be held accountable, it created this energy at the school where people knew they could say or do whatever they wanted to do. So in March of my sophomore year, I was literally just walking to band class. This is 1995. And I'm walking to band class one day after lunch, and a group of students just mob me and assault me right there in the school, a group of white students. And I was beaten so badly that I missed the rest of my sophomore year and all of my junior year of high school. I had fractures in my face and ribs. I had 3 spinal surgeries. And I mean, I was battered physically and emotionally. Like it was the lowest that I'd ever been at that point. And it took a lot out of me. It took whatever childhood I had left. It took that. Whatever innocence I had, that was gone. It also changed me physically. The surgeries were hard, and it had a big physical impact on me. But it also put something in me that I never could have predicted. It put in me like a heightened sensitivity to people who were experiencing injustice. And having experienced something so horrible myself and gotten no justice in response to that, it just caused me to have a deep sensitivity to people who are hurting, to people who are in pain, to people who've been wronged. And eventually that kind of heightened sensitivity is what really kind of caused me to have a heart for activism and organizing. I'm not glad that what happened to me happened, but had it not happened, I don't know that I would be here. You know, that was 25 years ago when I was assaulted. It changed the entire direction of my life. And, you know, you and I've shared a similar story of how trauma changed what we planned on doing with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people that hear that if you watch this now or later, just because you've experienced trauma doesn't mean that you have to lead out of that trauma. That's just how it happened to me. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I know plenty of people who've experienced great pain, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to lead from that place, but it impacted me in immeasurable ways. And to this day, I still feel the impact of that one day on how I pursue people who've done wrong in some kind of way, or how I support families through their pain, in part because I understand what that feels like. And so, yeah, that had I would probably say there were 3 or 4 events in my life that are kind of before and after events, where I see my life as kind of happening before or after a certain moment. And that was definitely one of those moments that just changed me forever.
Ooh, that one, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, there's something that I feel really resonates in your book is like, how do you channel this pain into gifts to share with the world? And, you know, no one should ever go through what you went through. No one should ever, you know, one of the things that I feel is the fact that, you know, you started with with you saying right now you're going through something, right? There's like a lot of attention on you. And I think what I always try to remind folks of is like, let's show some grace. We don't know what people have been through. We don't know what they're currently going through. And you've been through a lot. I've seen photos, you know, I'm reading your book, but I've also followed you for quite some time. And people don't know how to show grace sometimes. I think one thing that we learn by Mr. Belafonte is how do we, suspend our first judgment? How do we gather more information? How do we, check in with people and see, hey, what's up? What was this really about? Right. But, I just wanted to recognize that time in your life because it was such a pivotal moment for you dedicating your life to this work. And for you to now work with people who maybe perpetuate some of the events that happened to you, right? And to also have a forgiving heart and saying, look, there's no animosity here. I'm going to continue to make change. But thank you for that. And I also, there are no words, but just always know that you are in our thoughts.
Oh, always.
And always. I was resonating with your story because I think a lot of young people, when they enter high school, don't realize that it's not always safe, right? And I think the fact that we still haven't created a support system for young people to actually go to individuals. And so thank you for sharing that. You talked about Morehouse, right? Being kind of like your escape. It was like where you got to actually be who you were, right? You got to learn about your history, but you also got a message from one of your former Morehouse colleagues, classmates, while you were working at Global Green.
That's right.
To look at a video. And in your words, you said, I realized in that moment, for the first time in my life, I had witnessed a man die before my eyes. What did that do to you?
That was almost 6 years ago to the day. It was 6 years and about a month ago now in July of 2014. And you were also very impacted by this moment. I was living in Southern California. I moved to New York 2 years later, but I was living in Southern California, and a buddy of mine that I went to Morehouse with had come across the video of Eric Garner being killed by the NYPD. And at the time, we didn't even know Eric Garner's name. I came to know Eric's mother and wife and children and others. But at the time, the story had not even it would go viral the next day. But at the time, you have to almost go back in time, because I have now studied over 500 videos of people being killed by police, and including two that I saw for the first time today. And yet in 2014, there had never been a viral video of someone being killed by police. I had seen people die in movies, but I had never actually seen a man, a living, breathing, real human being, be alive at the beginning of a video, be killed, and be dead at the end. And I didn't feel like I had just watched a video. My brain processed it like I had just seen a man be lynched. Like my brain and my heart were like, oh no, I've just seen something. This wasn't supposed to happen. And my brain was firing off like, hey, you got to do something about this. I hadn't been desensitized to videos of violence. I had never seen anything like it before. It was literally the last day I ever worked at Global Green. I always like to give them a shout out, because they paid me for another month that I didn't deserve. But for the next month, I just threw my life into figuring out how could I help this family. And over that next month, there were families, including the family of Ezell Ford in Los Angeles, who lost their son, of Michael Brown, of John Crawford, of so many others who were killed during that time. And that is kind of one of the nexus moments of this current movement that we're in. And I made a decision there that really, I didn't know it the way I can say it now, but I made a decision literally just at my cubicle at Global Green, just like, I'm going to do something about this. I didn't know how to do it. I was naive and ignorant in a lot of ways. And I explain what that means in the book. But, I say to people that deciding to impact the problem begins with that type of decision, just to say, I don't know exactly how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to throw my life into trying to help this family get some semblance of justice. And, Erica Garner became a dear friend of mine, his oldest daughter, and she basically died fighting for justice for her father.
Right.
And she was just 29 years old and was one of my closest friends in this space. And she was a fearless, fierce advocate for her family. And, it still burns me up to this day that she was unable to live long enough to see any real semblance of justice. And so many families have that same story. We just crossed the 65th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till, and he literally still has living relatives that are still fighting for justice 65 years later. And this country has a way of making people fight much harder than they should,
And one of the people that fought for Emmett Till was his cousin, Erica Gordon Taylor, who recently passed away. And so it's, it's a long journey. And it's really important. I hear it all the time from Ashley and Michelle, how important it is to have people on their corner, right? And we do talk about the fact that this is a long distance run.
Yep.
You talk about, being a historian and understanding history and the way you connect it to the current time. But there's a chapter that I really love, chapter 1, where you talk about when the history books are written, the eating, sleeping, showering, shitting, working, laughing, and making love are completely removed.
It's true.
And you said history books have a way of erasing everything that make us full human. But really, this was a chapter where you threw in a lot of history. You threw in information from World War II, right? The Holocaust. You threw in just these organizing mechanisms, and you basically, the way I'm paraphrasing, the way you talked about it was the fact that they left out some of the most important components for us to really understand how it all happened, right? So, but I love this because, I think about you and Ray, like having 5 children, right? Or myself and Jay,
Yep.
going on our second baby, and no one really talks about, like, you know, how people had babies. There was a segment
It's
there.
not in the history books.
Yeah.
You know, like the truth is, like, as you right now, you can't separate who you are and what you do from the fact that you are 9 months pregnant, that you are organizing as a mother, as a spouse. But when stories are written and when history is told, it rubs all of that away, and it really simplifies who people are, and it takes away a lot of the humanity of how history is told, good and bad. And because it wipes away so many details, like one of my kids literally asked me, like, Dad, why does nobody ever pee in the history books? You know, and it's true. It's a funny observation. In the history books, it's like nobody ever has to pee, you know. And but what that does is it illustrates the reality that even basic bodily functions are missing from the way history is told.
Mhm.
And because of that, it also wipes away the nuances of how evil creeps in, of how injustice creeps in, and who is responsible for it. And so most history books just go from crisis to crisis to crisis, from battle to battle to battle. And it does in history books, particularly when you're talking like K through 12 education, they don't give kids the tools to really understand how these moments creep into existence. So it just goes from one moment to Adolf Hitler. And it's
Mhm.
like, no, no,
That's
no.
right.
No, there were years of little moments that built on bigger moments that snowballed into Hitler.
Mhm.
And so because we don't have the skill and don't have kind of the understanding of history to see how these things build up, all of a sudden, like, I feel very much now that we have there is real potential that over these next 2 months, like, it's already very dangerous and crazy out here. And over these next 2 months, like, I have a real concern that it could get exponentially worse. And I say that as somebody that's never an alarmist and am always slow to think that things are going to get a lot worse. But at the point in which uh, militias are showing up all over the country and people are being killed at protests and demonstrations, it's a scary time. And we just have to understand the warning signs, and the way we're educated doesn't really give us the skill to understand what those warning signs are.
Mhm. Mhm. That leads me into, you know, you talk a lot about like what is your gift and use it, but you
Yeah.
also had another chapter where you really focused on forgetting your excuses. And you
Mhm.
gave examples. Some of them were read earlier today. I'm too young. I'm too old. I'm too busy. I'm too white. I'm not smart enough. I don't know where to begin. I don't have money, which, you know, all of us in this world, actually in this world, you know, are using our own credit cards and so forth. But why did you feel it was important to share those examples where people oftentimes, was that really based on the fact that as you were answering the call to the people that you met through your travels, that you were also kind of sharing some of what you were hearing back?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great observation, Carmen, because what I would find was there would be a few examples of people who would be talked out of doing good.
Hmm.
What I mainly found was people talking themselves out of doing good. And that doesn't mean that there's not opposition. Of course, there's all types of oppression and opposition. There's systems of privilege. All of that stuff exists. But what I would normally find, no matter where I would go, if I was in at Harvard, Princeton, or Yale, if I was literally speaking at Facebook or Spotify, or if I was in jails or prisons, I would regularly find people at all levels of life talking themselves out of doing the thing that was on their heart to do. And people would come to me and tell me an idea, a vision, a dream, a concept that I would think like, listen, you should do that. And they would immediately, before the conversation was over, already begin to talk themselves down and say out loud the excuses and reasons why they just weren't the person for that thing. And what I learned speaking to tens of thousands of people over these past 6 years is we talk ourselves out of some of our best ideas. I think some of the most impactful ideas in the world have just died in people's minds. You know, things that I think could have actually changed the systems and structures that we're fighting against. People who had the capacity to change them just convinced themselves that for some reason or another, they weren't good enough. They were too old enough. They didn't have the skills or the resources or the degrees or the money. And what I try to encourage people is to say, listen, and here's a trick that people play with themselves. They look at themselves today and then they look at the thing they want to change and they just say like, whoever they are, I don't have the ability to change this big problem. And what I try to tell them is you don't have to change the big problem, but you do have to decide to begin the process. And it's when people make that decision that, you know what, I'm going to throw my life into trying to figure this out, that you begin to see the world differently. Doors begin to open. Luis is one of the best examples, I think, of somebody who leaned into his desire to make change. And as he leaned into it, not only did doors open up, but his skills grew. Like you grow and evolve as you fight for change. You know, Ashley and Michelle Monterosa, who are here with us tonight, um, they are now in many ways activists and organizers themselves.
That's right.
They are victims and they are grieving in the death of their brother, but because they decided I have to do something about this, it once you make that decision, it then colors the way. My dear friend Edwin Raymond, I never for my entire life had a friend who was a police officer, and never imagined that I would have a friend who was a police officer. He came into the NYPD as a brilliant man of integrity and saw things that were troubling to him, and he had to make a decision. Do I shut up and keep this stuff to myself, which is by and large the police code? Do I see racism, bigotry, inequality, abuse in the department and say nothing? Or do I actually speak up and try to change this thing? And him and a group of other current and retired officers sued the NYPD for the systemic, problematic, disturbing policies they had in the department. But it began with the decision of saying, like, no, I just can't accept this. And it's cost this man his safety, his security. It almost cost him his career on multiple occasions. But it all begins with an initial decision of saying, nah, I can't stand for that. I just can't. And everything grows from there.
And you say that very clearly. In order to make change, you have to make a choice.
Yep.
Right. Yep. And so, you know, as we're organizing towards the election and we have to make a choice, right? How do we ground our votes with the current political climate?
Yeah, you know, I have my two oldest daughters are 18 and 20. And this is the first presidential election that they get to vote in. And there are lots of little lessons that I've had to teach both of them, because Joe Biden on the list of the final 10 Democratic candidates, he was like number 10 for young people. Like it was so low on the list. And so young people have had to realize that voting in a presidential election is often not exciting. That as a matter of fact, it's rare that you get to vote for somebody for president that you are just over the top excited about. And young people are learning, my own children are learning, and not just young people, but people across the country are having to understand, one, the practical nature of supporting a candidate for president. Carmen, I've been a vocal critic of both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris for years and years. However, I can still see that even with all of my criticisms considered, even still, they are significantly better than Mike Pence and Donald Trump.
That's right.
And so that's one thing on the presidential level, is to say, well, people say, well, how are they better? I mean, I could unpack the policies and the positions. I was a huge critic of, I help elect district attorneys around the country, and Kamala Harris, during her time as district attorney of San Francisco, which was in the early 2000s, had a lot of policies that I was deeply concerned about. But I've had to communicate to people, I don't know Kamala. I don't work for her. I don't work for the Democratic Party. Nobody asked me to say this. She has just gotten significantly better on issues of justice reform. I saw her speak about ending qualified immunity. And as a matter of fact, I don't think any Democrat in the Senate, including Bernie Sanders, has spoken out about ending qualified immunity better than she has. And she's spoken about not only decriminalizing and legalizing cannabis and recreational weed, but expunging people's criminal records. Well, if you don't listen to her, you might say, well, damn, she used to prosecute people for that. And it's true. I honestly think she has evolved. I think that we view her worst years through 2020 lenses. And you kind of have to view her 2004 decisions through 2004 lenses in a way. I say that to say that, even if the two of them are not your dream candidates, what we have in Pence and Trump is actively dangerous to us today. And it doesn't mean that Biden and Kamala are beyond critique.
Right.
If they're elected, we will have to fight to hold them accountable. We'll have to fight for them to have better policies. I think what I primarily focus on is also all of the other down ballot races, from Senate seats to congressional seats to assembly seats. We're fighting in California right now to pass several criminal justice reform bills. And Ashley and Michelle, your husband Jay, my team at Grassroots Law, we're all fighting for them. But moderate Democrats, not Republicans, moderate Democrats are the ones working against us. And we have to encourage people like you. We can vote them out. We can run people against them and try again next year and the year after that. And so some of it is just getting into the details of who do we elect. Like I'll close with this thought. Right now in Kenosha, Wisconsin, there are several just horrible videos of the sheriff of Kenosha. One, there's this video of him saying that he wants to warehouse people and lock them away for the rest of their lives. He said that after some people were caught shoplifting at TJ Maxx. Like, just to give that context, that video wasn't even filmed after the uprising there in Kenosha. That video was filmed after people were arrested for shoplifting at a TJ Maxx. He's talking about warehousing them for the rest of their lives. Well, that man was voted into that position. Like, the sheriff is an elected position. He, from all indications, is in a Democratic county. The almost every elected official in that county is a Democrat. It's like, listen, this man can be voted out of office. And we focus so much on the presidential races, and they matter. But we have to focus on who is the sheriff, who is the district attorney, who is the school board member, who are the people whose decisions are impacting our communities and the people that we love. And it's not always the president. We have to be interested in all of those races.
And also, I think we have to encourage some of our own to run for office,
Oh,
right? Like
absolutely.
Lieutenant Edwin Raymond is running for city council. We have Jamani Williams,
Yep.
who is a good friend of ours, who also ran for office and is actually in office. But, you know, I think it's so important for people to understand what you're saying is not only do we need to vote every 4 years for the presidential election, but we also need to vote locally, right? What's happening on a local level is so key. But, you know, we could talk about the system because I also have some, you know, I worked in Santa Cruz, ultimately went into the probation department to do system accountability. And really what, you know, we were taught in the probation department, I did intake and investigations. And one of the things that we talked about was like learning the social history of people, right? So you just don't start with what they did. It's like what has been happening. A lot of what people are committing are poverty crimes, right? And my husband always talks about like back in the day, mass incarceration led to poverty, right? Or was it that poverty led to mass incarceration, right? Is that
poverty is criminalized in this country in profound ways. In like there are a list of over 1,000 crimes I put in parentheses that are basically just people being criminalized because they're poor.
Exactly.
And there's so many ways, you know, we say it like being poor in this country is expensive. It is costly. Being unemployed is costly. I lived in California for 5 years, and I was organizing in Los Angeles with mothers who had unpaid tickets. And because they had unpaid tickets, they then got arrested because they couldn't afford to pay the tickets, or they would have. People don't just like having unpaid tickets. Because their tickets were unpaid, they lost their license. Because they lost their license, they still had to drive to work every day. They lost their license. They got pulled over. They got arrested. They couldn't afford bail. And I met a group of mothers who literally lost their children because they had been jailed, because they couldn't afford their bail. If you trace it all the way back, because they got a ticket they couldn't pay. And it's like all of it was the criminal. Had any one of those women been wealthy, none of that would have happened. They would have just dropped the money. Things are good. Basically, their crime was poverty itself. And we're talking about women who literally lost their kids to the system because they simply could not afford a traffic ticket. That then sent them down this dangerous spiral. Our communities are full of those stories. I would reason that there are probably hundreds of thousands of people whose lives have spun out of control, ultimately entering them into mass incarceration and all the systems and structures and probation, simply because they couldn't afford something. And you know, you and I have worked with countless families all over the country whose loved ones ultimately suffered simply because they couldn't afford bail, because poverty somehow intersected with the system. And Jay is right. It's a chicken or the egg thing. Mass incarceration and poverty, it feeds itself because of the way the system was built.
And, you know, just so people know, it costs about $10,000 to send a child from kindergarten to high school. And it costs over $250,000 per year to house a young person in a detention center.
Yeah.
So just think about
expensive. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, it is. It takes an enormous amount of resource and staff. And what people don't know, when they hear the phrase defunding the police, what we're really saying is the equation that you just gave, that most public school children get $10,000 per year per pupil.
No, it's actually K through 12 costs $10,000.
Right, but then that the same thing of keeping people in in jails and juvenile detention centers cost 25 times that amount. You know, it's an outrageous waste of resource. And what we know, and I worked for years full time as a teacher in Atlanta's jails and prisons, is I would see kids that I would pour my heart and soul into kids. Like there would be kids that that would just like grab my heart, and I was like, oh, this kid's got it. And they would get out and we would celebrate and like, I'm so proud of you that you made it out. And then 4 weeks later, I would be there teaching, and there they would be again. And it was because the system was designed in a way not to keep them out. The system was literally built and designed to keep them in. They lived in high police communities where every move is tracked and measured, investigated by police. Every mistake you make, you know, I tell people all the time, nobody is held more responsible for mistakes they've made and mistakes they haven't made than poor people, than doubly so of poor people in Black communities that are held super responsible for anything and everything. And so all of this money, not millions, billions and billions of dollars spent not actually fixing it, not actually fixing the problem, and not making cities or communities any safer as a result. Like the lie, Carmen, is that we don't care about public safety. It's like to hell with that. Like we live in these communities. Like the community that I live in a community that Edwin grew up in. And
that's right.
This community is like, I need this community to be safe. So like when I'm talking about defunding the police, I live in a community that struggles with violent crime and poverty and addiction and mental health. What we're saying is, no, we want the root problems to be addressed here. Because if you go to the safest communities where I live in New York, they're not safe because there are police on every corner. They're safe because there are jobs, because people have health care, people get treatment. Like what certain communities define themselves as being safe as is very different than the way other people want to define Black and brown communities in particular, define safety for them. You know, we're just saying there's smarter ways to use this money.
That's right. That's right. And I'm really glad you broke that down for folks that really don't understand the defund the police conversation. But this is going to be our last question. And this was a question that was shared by one of our Gathering for Justice staff. It was Jasmine who wanted to know is, how do we show up for our people when they're getting scrutinized and get people to refocus on the work?
You know, it can be really hard to get people to focus in 2020 in general. Like 2020 has so much coming at us that it's doubly hard for me to get other people to focus. Like as the best advice that I have for Jasmine and others is, first, do your best to remain as laser focused as you can. And Jasmine, I say that, like, I have to tell myself that every day. There are things that are always pulling me away from my work, like I see every day as a day for me to get a whole lot done. And then there's so many distractions that can pull me away. And I can look back at the end of the day and say, damn, I did not do with my day today nearly as much as I hoped to accomplish. And at the end of the day, we can hardly do anything to cause other people to focus. The best we can really do is to focus ourselves, focus our work, and hope that people, by other people seeing us focus, will cause them to say, yeah, I want to be like that, or I want to live like Jasmine. And it's hard, you know. Social media can be a distraction. The news can be a distraction. You know, you have to not only make a decision on what you're going to fight for. One of the things that I have a whole chapter on is you have to work from a real strategic plan so that you know I'm a part of this plan. I'm working my
Mhm.
plan. And there's several plans that I'm a part of today that when my life gets really crazy, I just kind of laser focus myself back on my plan. And so I hear all the noise, all the hate. I've been the number one trending topic over and over all week this week. And I just try to say, all right, let me focus back on my plan. And anything else other than this is a distraction, you know?
I really appreciate that. And, I also really appreciate this conversation. I thank you for giving us your time, but also the fact that, we always think about you. We always come to you when, either you make the call or we make the call when we need some
Absolutely.
support for some of these campaigns and
Yep.
these families that really need the level of awareness that you could bring to it. And you're right, like social media is a powerful tool. It's an opportunity to share information that otherwise people wouldn't receive, but it's also a tool that can be manipulated and not used so well. But your story is so powerful. And thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. And I hope that, we can continue to have these
Yeah.
conversations. Um, and so, any last words you want to share with folks before
Well,
we end the program?
well, first, thank you and thank your beautiful community for hosting me here. And we're rooting for you. People can't they only see a part of you right now, but you are due to have a baby any day now. And we are excited for you and grateful that it's it's a huge honor to me. As I told you, I have 5 kids that I get to be anywhere in your world these few days before the baby is born is exciting. um I just want to encourage people and leave people with some encouragement. As a historian, there's something that does keep me deeply encouraged. It's that as horrible as history often gets, and it can get really low. And I had to have a serious conversation with my older kids recently to tell them, like, yes, where we are now is low, but I promise you it can get worse. What
Mm,
I know from history is that things always rebound and people always fight back. And I don't know where on the spectrum of the dip. I don't know if we're at the bottom. I don't know if we're at the bottom and working our way up. All I know is that when I look at every low moment in human history, the worst moments, people always fight out of those moments. And so this moment can often feel really low. Um, the good news is that those moments never last forever. The hard news is it's not the moment that ends, it's the people that end it. We are
mm,
going to be the people that get us out of this moment. And these moments can last sometimes for months, they can last for years. Sometimes, Carmen, if you think of the transatlantic slave trade as a moment that lasted for hundreds of years,
right.
um, we have to fight our way out of this dip that we find ourselves in. We have to outsmart and outorganize the people who are working against us.
Hmm.
But I have hope because these low moments, they're never permanent. Never at any point in human history does it last forever. It always comes to an end in some way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Yeah. Thank
Sean,
you,
for
Carmen.
your words of wisdom. Thank you. Sending so much love to you, Ray, and your family. And so I hope you all enjoyed this program as much as I really enjoyed the conversation. Be sure to get your copy of Big Change. And you could find a list of Black-owned booksellers to purchase from at the website makingchangebook.com. We are so grateful for you and for everyone who joined us this evening. Please make sure to follow us on social media at NY Justice League and at Gather number 4 Justice, and visit our website gatheringforjustice.org. And if you would like to support our work, you can Cash App us at $gathering4 justice, or you can text GFJ15 to 44321. I want to thank all our readers. I want to thank all of you who participated, and I really want to thank Ray and Sean King's family. And Sean, there are so many ways to contribute to this movement. As I always say, there's a lane for everybody. Jump in. But like Sean mentions in his book, you have more power and potential than I think you truly understand. Making change starts with one huge decision, a decision that comes from a place of deep personal contemplation. This decision not only will change the course of your life, but it will affect the cause you care about most. Thank you for tuning in, and good night.